Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We have Jeremy Bowers and Rachel Shorey here from the New York Times. And they are programmers at the New York Times, and they'll be talking about the election 2016 edition. All right. The floor is theirs now.
Good morning. We're sorry this is at 8:30. If it makes you feel any better, it's early for us too. So, everything will get into the swing about the time we're through 50 of these slides. So the last four will really sing. It'll be really great. But until then, no promises. All right. So the other way this is going to work is Rachel is doing all the slide movement. So I'm going to shout at her, wave my arms or whatever when it's time to move slides. So don't be terrified if I wave my arms like I'm going crazy. All right. So Rachel. All right. But also move slides. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. Wait. No! Are we going to have to use the keyboard? Boop. Nope, not going to use the keyboard. There we go. All right, so you were in store for three things this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about exoskeletons, which is my favorite topic in the entire world. Rachel is going to talk about how to make nice with reporters. And then together we're going to talk to you about the perfectly normal election that happened in 2016 and how there was nothing weird about it at all. And why everyone understands exactly why it happened, and nobody was wrong about it on election night. All right, so first, exoskeletons. There we go. Yeah, right. All right. Other way. There we go. So I like exoskeletons because I like beat reporters, and I really like extending the capacity of the reporters at the New York Times. And so I'd like to introduce you to somebody. I'd like to introduce you to Adam Liptak. Adam Liptak is our Supreme Court reporter. He was a Pulitzer finalist for explanatory reporting, and generally is a really fantastic and swell guy. And he knows more about the Supreme Court than practically anybody walking on our earth, which is handy. And another fact about Adam is that he was the Times' legal counsel for years. So not only is he really good about writing about the Supreme Court, but more than likely could have tried a case in front of them with no problems. Thankfully, as Times counsel, he never had to do one of those. But maybe looking forward, if we have any issues with the Trump administration, perhaps we can count on someone like Adam to help us, our First Amendment issues. So next. All right, so this is what a beat reporter looks like in my head. This is from the movie His Girl Friday. And so reporters are excellent at a particular set of behaviors, right? Reporters are really good at making phone calls and taking notes, writing stories on deadline, being badgered by their editors. There's an entire stack of behaviors that reporters have naturally selected into being very good at. But some of those behaviors are really useful in our current in the current day and age, right? Like being able to write on deadline, super handy. Being able to write short or long, also super handy. But it is frustrating sometimes for reporters in the new era that it is hard for them to deal with things like large data sets or quickly updating data that they have, that it's very difficult for them to get their hands on. So this is why I want to turn Adam Liptak from His Girl Friday into Ripley from Aliens. So Ripley is wearing an exoskeleton. It enables her to fight aliens, which is what I imagine Adam Liptak would be doing if he wasn't our Supreme Court reporter. And so an exoskeleton is actually a perfect metaphor for how I think we should be thinking about our reporters, right? Ripley is the most talented member of the crew on Aliens. She stayed alive and everybody else died. And note that she's using an exoskeleton and not a robot. The robot died. His name, I don't even remember what his name was, but he was basically like a pool of white fluid at the end of the movie. But Ripley was still alive because she was outfitted with an exoskeleton. An exoskeleton is not a robot. An exoskeleton is what you do, only more so. If you want to lift something heavy, an exoskeleton lets you lift something heavier. If you want to run fast, an exoskeleton lets you run faster. That is why I like exoskeletons and not robots. I don't want to replace reporters. I want to make them better at what they're already doing. I want to make them stronger, faster, better, etc. Right? So all of the behaviors that Adam engages in as a reporter are behaviors I would like to make better with software, typically. All right, Rachel. There we go. This is what it looks like when we make reporters better with software. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but if you look in the middle there, there's something called SCOTUSbot. And SCOTUSbot is a piece of software that we wrote that watches the Supreme Court's website for changes. In particular, it watches for updates to a page called slip decisions. These slip decisions are issued instantly when the court announces a decision, sometimes several minutes before the paper copies are even made available to reporters, which is super handy for us to have access to them, because if you click on the PDF link there, you can read the entire text of the decision. You can decide, what the voting was, like which justices voted yay, which justices voted nay, and it can make your reporting that much better if you're going to report almost instantly on something that's happening, right? So Rachel, if you'll swap, I want to tell you guys the story of the running of the interns. This is kind of a DC thing. I completely apologize. But so the Supreme Court session is weighted so that the very most important cases of the session happen in June and July, right, at the very end of the term. And what will happen is, for these really big decisions, the Supreme Court will release the decision in what are called boxes. They're actual literal cardboard boxes. And the thicker the decision, the more boxes it takes them to distribute it. And what are they distributing? Yes, paper. That's how you get it. You have to go to the Supreme Court press office, you have to check in with your Senate press pass, and then you have to wait for them to hand you a sheaf of paper, and then you have a decision. You can either wait for the next piece of paper, which would be another decision, or you can turn and bolt out the fire door and run it to where your camera crew is waiting so that they can read the text of the decision and then talk about it. So if you watched any of the big cases in 2014, 2015, or 2016, you would have watched this happen, right? It's like an intern screams down the outside of the Supreme Court building, paper in hand, ready to hand it off to a TV reporter who can talk about it. So Rachel, if you'll swap. It's not an insignificant run. It's about 150 yards. You have to go about the north exit of the of the Supreme Court press room. You have to run a hard left there, and then you make a sharp right. It's like a button hook, and then you have to turn it around there at the edge, and that's when you get it to your reporter who's waiting for you, right? And so the interns famously wear wear tennis shoes. They run like crazy, and the first person who gets it out, almost always gets their picture on Twitter or something like that. This is Chad, the best intern of 2016 or whatever. So Rachel, if you'll swap one more time. The sad thing is automation is murdering jobs all over the United States, including but not limited to the running interns. So last year, Voisin versus the United States is the first decision that was out. Chad here at the bottom is running as fast as he can. Before Chad even got around the corner, we already had a web page up with all the details of the case, including the votes and a short sentence from Adam Liptak. And Chad hadn't even gotten to the TV cameras yet. This is why automation is so handy and why having robots is really good, bots that can help you out. In this case, this was an extension of Adam Liptak. It's what he would have already been doing. He would have already been walking outside of the court and maybe texting an editor or something like that. But if he would have had to wait for the physical copy of the paper to be available to him, the physical copy of the decision, and leaf through it, he would never have been able to do this in time. So Adam was able to stay at the court, was able to continue reporting, and then write an excellent wrap-up story at the end of the day, rather than having to exit, because once you exit, you can't go back in. And so we were able to have this little chunk of text available by an editor who was sitting in the DC office next to me, which is fantastic. And so this is just one of the ways in which we can take a traditional form of reporting, Adam Liptak, Supreme Court, very traditional, very paper-based, no data or anything involved at all, and we can wrap it with software and make it better than it previously was. So I want to show you a couple other ideas that we had for extending Adam's capabilities that have very little to do with spreadsheets or math, though they are pretty. So one of the things that Adam needs to do at the end of the term is write a wrap-up. He needs to talk about what happened in the Supreme Court this term, what were the big trends, what were the things that really made a difference. And he has an excellent gut instinct for what he thinks happened this year. But checking your gut is one of the hardest things to do if you're a reporter. It's especially difficult to do in a place where there is very little hard data, very little stuff to help you check your check your instincts, right? And so the one thing I built for Adam was a dashboard that characterized all of the decisions that the court makes in a term, and it would code them up from very liberal to very conservative based on the number of justices that had voted, right? So on the far right-hand side is a 9-0 conservative decision. On the far left-hand side, a 9-0 liberal decision, right? And so this also shows the number of decisions that were made in the term. As you can see, the bars get wider or shorter depending on the number of decisions that were made. And then there's a really handy version over there that shows them all normalized to a single, to the same number of decisions, right? So you can see, there were comparatively more liberal or comparatively more conservative decisions this year than there were in previous terms, right? And so this was really greatly, this turned into a story almost instantly because, Rachel, boop. So this turned into a story almost instantly because Adam had this gut feeling that was it feels like even though everybody thinks the court is very conservative, because the median justice, Anthony Kennedy, is actually a fairly conservative voter, he says it feels like the court has moved a little bit to the left. And so we take a look. Dashboard says it's moved to the left. We look at some of the metrics inside. Look at some certain decision types. Yep, it's moved to the left. So this is enough for Adam to sit down and write a story called "The Court's Surprising Move Leftward," which is great, and it flew in the face of conventional wisdom until the court later released a very liberal decision later in the term and made Adam look like he was prescient, when what he was really doing was just using the data that we had available to us about how the court makes decisions, and it allowed him to have this like really great insight that instead of being like his spleen telling him, "I feel like the court is more liberal this year," he had some like really good numbers, and we could be quantitative about it. We could say exactly how much liberal it was, how much more liberal it was this term than in previous terms, and we could quantify the number of terms in which they had previously been conservative. Right? It's super handy, very useful for us, and makes for a really great news story. Yeah. I know, right? So this is a part where we lean pretty heavily on academia, right? So Washington University in St. Louis and the University of Michigan have been since the 1940s teaming up to essentially rate decisions on a scale, right? And so they use a methodology that they've used since the very beginning to rate decisions as if they are liberal or conservative. The good news is that they somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the decision in a given term are able to put on that spectrum, and for the others, they just say this decision doesn't really fit in a bucket. It doesn't really fit on one of the scales of ideology, right? And a lot of it is really standard stuff. Like if the decision is fairly pro-gun control, then they would consider that to be conservative. If the decision is undoes abortion restrictions, they would consider that to be fairly liberal. It's not, and there are a lot of cases that are kind of in the margin. And for those cases, they either wait and see, or they'll mark them unknown, and then they go back through later in the term and like check. They have a team of cross checkers that go back through and check. Adam is on the team of cross checkers, which is kind of like a snake eating its own tail in some cases, but it is fascinating. We like them not because they're perfect on any given decision, but over the breadth of time, the fact that they've repeated the methodology over years is really useful to us, and it makes it easier to compare the court over various terms. So we like it. There are a handful of like competing methodologies that we could use. One of them is a pretty recent one from a professor at Georgetown University, and we're kind of looking into whether or not there might be like an ensemble model that we could use that would like take both of them into account. But we would want to talk to like everybody before we did that. All right, so there's also other things that we do just about justices, so not about the term itself. This is the page that we built him about Anthony Kennedy, and so there are like to me, Supreme Court justices are basically anonymous. Like it's really hard. Like if you saw Anthony Kennedy or Justice Sotomayor in line in front of you at the supermarket, like I happen to have done because she shops at a supermarket down the street from my house in D.C., you might not recognize them at all. As a matter of fact, Justice Sotomayor is just hanging out there at Trader Joe's, and like nobody was like badgering her or talking to her. She doesn't travel with like Secret Service or anything like that. They're just people when they're not at the court. But that anonymity comes at like kind of a price, right? Which is it's a whole third of your government. It's there are only 3 branches, and this is one of them. And the fact that we know very little about them makes it difficult for us as reporters and as journalists to explain to you what their tendencies are like, why they vote the way they do. The fact that they are anonymous makes it difficult for us, in short, to explain to you how they do their business, right? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what characterizes a Supreme Court justice, what makes them interesting, and what makes them notable, right? And so the thing about Justice Kennedy that's very interesting is that he is the swing vote on the current court. That is to say, he's right about the middle. There are 3 conservative justices, 1 waiting, and 4 liberal justices, and 1 justice that's right about down the middle, and that's Justice Kennedy. And you can see that you would guess that he was the middle justice just based on this voting bit down here in the bottom right corner. It says career win-loss record. There's what the average justice would do, and then there's what Justice Kennedy would do. So you would expect that as the median justice, he would be involved in more wins on a 5-4 decision. He would be on the winning side more often because his vote literally makes it the win in many cases, right? He's also the more often than not on the winning side of a 6-3. He's on the winning side of a 7-2, and of course he's on the winning side of 8-1s, right? This is exactly what you would expect from the swing vote. In almost every vote distribution, he is way above average in terms of his ability to win cases, which is fascinating, right? It means he's on the winning side more often. All that does is tell us he's the swing justice. evidence, right? It's confirming a thing that we already believe that we know to be true, and then allows us to quantify just how much we know that this is the case. There's some other sort of interesting things, right? If you want to know whether or not the swing justice is actually a little bit conservative or not, you can look and see which justices the justice tends to vote with the most often. And so that's the pairwise comparison up there on the top right. Justice Kennedy tends to vote with Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, Justice Scalia, and Justice Thomas, all the most conservative members of the court, which is fascinating. He's the swing vote. The court itself is a little bit liberal, but yet he tends to vote with conservative justices more often. Crazy times. And then we have like similar justices, and my favorite thing down here at the bottom, lone dissents. It's fascinating to look and see how many times a justice is the only person sitting out of an 8-1 decision. Justice Kennedy hardly ever does it. He does it basically once a decade. He's done it once in '88, once in '97, once in 2004, and once in 2010. That's exactly what you'd expect from the swing vote. Justice Thomas, we could barely even fit his on the screen. He sits out of he's the lone dissenter almost all the time, several times just in the last term. Fascinating. See, and it shows you a little bit about who they are as people and sort of why they make decisions the way they do. All right, and with that, now you understand why I would like to build exoskeletons and what a software exoskeleton would actually look like in this case. Maybe some charts for a reporter to look at and a bot that will help them know when the Supreme Court decision's been posted. Now, Rachel is going to talk to you about when she wants to use the telephone and how to make friends with Nick Confessori.
Oh, yeah, I need you to take that. I can't do all of this at once. Hi, I'm Rachel. Jeremy and I actually kind of came up with what we wanted to talk about separately, but it really ended up working very well together because I'm going to go deeply into sort of a specific example of one of these exoskeleton-like things that has been a major project of our team and basically was the majority of my time during the 2016 election cycle. I'm just going to start by saying that I came into this with not a ton of reporting experience, really not any at all, but a bit of writing experience and a lot of software experience. And being told to use the telephone to like call a real person and find out like real information from them for the first time, I was like, okay, that's scary. So I'm not actually really going to talk a lot about telephones, but campaign finance is the major thing that I worked on in the 2016 election cycle. This is the Federal Elections Commission. If you're running for office, you have to tell the Federal Elections Commission about all the money you spent and all the money you raised, with like only a very small number of exceptions. And you also have to do this if you're spending money on behalf of getting somebody else elected. So that would be parties, PACs, that kind of thing as well. Go ahead. So this is public data. This is what public data often looks like. In this case, it's pretty terrible. And perhaps you know a bit about data with like big text files with commas in them, and you're like, oh, this is easy. I would just take this thing and import it into Excel and like have a little fun with it there. But unfortunately, that would not be a good idea for two reasons. One, by the time you get towards the end of an election cycle, these things are millions of rows long. Each campaign's one of these things is 1 million rows long. And second of all, the number of commas and thus separate fields in this file is totally arbitrary based on the first thing in the line. Can you find like that SA17? So in order to deal with this file, what I actually have to do is look up what SA17 means, and then there's like a definition somewhere on the FEC's website of like, okay, if it says SA17 in this first row, it means we're going to have, this is how many different fields you're going to have in this data, and this is what they're all going to mean. But like a different row, I guess they're all SA17s for the most part here, because there's one that says text, but oh, okay. Well, that's going to be totally unrelated to what you saw in SA17. If you try and put it in Excel, it won't really be able to tell you anything, unfortunately. Yeah. Next slide. So, okay, that got moved around a little, but this is really important. And so this is sort of the money quote. I guess that's no pun intended there. The money quote from Justice Kennedy in the Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission decision, which some of you may have heard of. It's the decision that allows outside money to be spent on behalf of political candidates in a much more aggressive way than it was before. and he specifically talks about the importance of transparency in this decision, right? Like, they made this decision to allow more spending in political campaigns, and the check on that is that there will be more transparency, and people will be able to see who was spending the money and make their decisions based on that. So if what you're looking at is that data that we saw in the previous slide, that might be transparent in that it's available, but it's not actually transparent to the average voter. And that's, I think, a really critical part where journalists come in. It's our job to make it usable by like normal consumers who don't really want to go and read million row, completely arbitrarily delimited files, because it's hard. For the most part, no. For the most part, I mean, the most common thing we saw that was like quote unquote, I'm even going to put illegal in quotes here, is just they have to get these things out so fast that, and there's so much volume coming into a big campaign that they really just miss a lot of stuff. Like most of the stuff that we saw that was like, that looks weird, got amended and corrected by them within a month. There's some like sneaky stuff. The most sneaky stuff that is getting hidden in one of two totally different ways. One is through anonymous LLCs, which like, it doesn't matter how transparent you are on this form. If you are a company that was set up in Delaware in order to like have another company in Montana, started by another company in Montana in order to give money to a super PAC, we can track some of those down. Depends how much money they're giving, whether it's worth our time to do so. Or you give to another kind of a group that I'm not really going to talk about now, but that is doing non-electioneering communication. And an example of non-electioneering communication might be like Jeremy Bowers, Senate candidate or whatever. He lives in DC, he can't do that, but whatever. Jeremy Bowers really doesn't like puppies. Call Jeremy Bowers and tell him you wish he liked puppies. That's not political. I'm not telling you to vote for him. I'm just telling you to call him. If you decide not to vote for him, that's on you. Not me. I didn't do it. So that's where a lot of like more sneaky stuff happens. They don't have to report that money because it was not election related. Anyway, right. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is that the Federal Elections Commission does make this data a little bit easier to get and more transparent, but it takes them a couple of days to a couple of weeks to get to that point. And if you're a person who's like looking historically or whatever, that's probably good enough. But if you're the New York Times or one of our competitors, that's not good enough. We want to know by the next day or by within a day or two what's happening. And the only way to get that out is through these terrible data files. Anyway, so this is like a not very great diagram of exactly what it is that I am doing here. Lost my notes. So it makes it look sort of easy, but it's really not. So with the Federal Elections Commission, what I'm doing is I'm just checking in with them every 10 minutes saying like, is there a new file? Nope. Is there a new file? Nope. Is there a new file? Oh, look, Bernie Sanders filed, which is actually a terrible thing to have happen because his files were like a gazillion pages long and often sort of choked up my machinery for a little while. Then there's a major processing step. And that, what I'm doing there is like, as I said before, looking up each of these lines, trying to figure out, I mean, I'm not doing it manually, but the code is looking up each of these lines, trying to match it with the headers that it came from, and then also doing some stuff like removing duplicates. There's a big duplicates problem that we have to deal with here, and checking for like a few things, a few just general weirdnesses that they're allowed to do but make the result like less easy to interpret. So we have some rules that we kind of apply to make it easier for a human being, like a reporter, to read. We dump it all in a database, and then we pop it out to a web application that is internal to the New York Times. And the reason that we're doing this internally there's an example. That's actually a good place to go. Right. So this is what it looks like if you have searched. I think this is I just searched for like some of the biggest donors. And so this is, if you remember what that, I should have showed the thing again. If you remember what that document looked like, this is what it's turning into when I dump it into my my application. And so these are just some of the biggest individual donors to the 2016 cycle. Although some of them got really big refunds. Like Tobin Waybauer, he didn't ever end up spending his money. He like dumped his money into a PAC, and then he waited around. He was a Ted Cruz supporter. He like, I don't know what he was waiting for. I mean, whatever. But he never spent that money. It just sat in the PAC, and then about 8 months later, they actually spent like $1 million of that $10 million, like just sort of maintaining the legal entity, and then he just refunded it to himself. PACs are weird. Anyway, some of these are other names you might recognize, like major big donors who the Adelsons are pretty famous for giving a lot of money. They're casino folks from Las Vegas. So yeah. And then we also know about how they're spending their money, Jeremy. So this search was every expenditure that included the word hats. You might not be surprised that certain campaigns bought more hats than certain other campaigns. Hats were actually a category that we were tracking for the Trump campaign, because every time somebody made a donation so if you buy something from a campaign, that's counted as a donation. Every time they made one of those donations, a person made a donation, the Trump campaign then had to go and buy those hats and send them out. So yeah, those Make America Great hats were a major expense, and those two are just different ways that the Trump campaign accounted for fundraising, even though you see both Donald Trump for president and Make America Great Again. It's just like a weird fluke in how they report this money. But yeah, hats, there were a lot of them. Next slide. So how do we turn this into a story? This guy is named Nick Confessori. He's the campaign finance reporter at the Times. He does a lot of other things too, but during election season, he specializes in that. He also generally specializes in wealthy people, which is kind of a funny beat, but he's good at it, and it works well with campaign finance. He has a big brain full of Pulitzer-winning thoughts, and he's good. He actually was part of a Pulitzer team. He did not win it individually, but he worked on the Governor Spitzer. I don't know how much you guys know about Governor Spitzer of New York. He was governor, then he got caught up in a little prostitution situation, and is no longer governor. Anyway, so Nick worked on that, and the team won a Pulitzer for that. So he is like awesome, smart. He's really good at synthesizing a lot of information quickly, making complicated things easy to read about, and calling people on the telephone and getting them to tell him all their secrets. I have sat with him as he does this, and it's just like magical to me how he makes people tell them everything. Next, so this is me, Rachel Shorey. Hi. I have a brain that thinks thoughts like data, and is it lunchtime yet? And I have many skills, but they really do not overlap an awful lot with Nick's skills. Next. So anyway, the question is, how can we both do the things that we do best and tell the most accurate, compelling, complete, and nuanced story? And in order to do that, we need a couple of things. So here's the technology we talked about a moment ago. This is like sort of the front page. I showed you just some of the samples. So I wrote this, as I said, by pulling the data in from the Federal Elections Commission. And people often ask me if they see this, they're like, why isn't this public? Why can't anyone use it? And the answer is that there's so much weird, nuanced stuff inside this particular set of data that the job of making it, of being 100% accurate would be like a 10-person job on this. We don't have the time and the resources to invest in being 100% accurate in anything that's in this database. If what it is we have reporters looking at it, they can check whatever it is they're going to put in a story. They can check it with me, or they can check it on their own. But if we were putting this on the internet and the big T was on it, people would expect it to be 100% accurate. And it's just mostly the source data is not 100% accurate. And there's just so much weird stuff in there and so many like different ways of dealing with this that we can't. It's like above my pay grade to get this stuff 100% accurate all the time. So it is an internal tool that we use to make stories. There are people who publish more outward-facing tools. ProPublica is a big one of them. If you want to poke through this data, that is probably a good place to look. Yeah. So the other thing we need beyond technology, and I think this is underappreciated, is trust. I went and found Nick up in New York. I'm in DC mostly, but I was up in New York the other day, and I was like, Nick, I'm doing this presentation about collaborating with reporters. I need a picture of you giving me a high five. And Nick is like, he's like so smooth, and he goes on TV all the time, and he's like, oh, high five pictures never look good. And I was like, come on, Nick. So he was like, I'll just put my arm around you. So here's me and Nick. We actually do know and like each other. So why is trust important, and how did we really go about building it? Nick didn't know me before this election cycle. I was pretty new to the Times, and I was basically like thrown at him and told like, this is going to be your campaign finance nerd for this cycle. Deal with it. If we want to write good stories, he has to know that my numbers are going to be good. And I can say things like, look, Nick, I wrote a lot of tests and they all passed. And that might mean a lot to me. And to him, that means nothing, right? I mean, he hasn't seen any validation of what I have worked on. So I also know that if I give him a number, or if I am speculating about something, or if I see something that looks weird but maybe isn't weird, he's not going to do something crazy with it, right? I need to trust that he is going to not make me look dumb if I give him numbers. In the first few times that we worked together, he really used me as like he just would ask me for a specific number, and then he would honestly go and check it himself or check it with someone else. And once we got to the point where he knew that wasn't going to happen, that I wasn't going to be wrong, or if I was going to be wrong, I would look into it, or if I wasn't sure, I would tell him. We really actually ended up having a great collaborative relationship. Another thing that helped a lot is Sichuan food. We spent a lot of time eating late night takeout together on campaign finance filing night, and just kind of getting to know each other. And I think it ended up being a pretty great collaboration. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we actually did that in a moment. So Nick and I, we have this technology. We trust each other now. Okay, where does the story actually come from? We actually had three ways of generating campaign finance stories. This is sort of the first one. Nick says, looks like something's happening. What, like, I'm hearing gossip. Can you confirm or deny that gossip? We did a lot of this. I would say 80% of the time I was like, nope, no evidence of that. And a lot of that happened because, it was being sort of pushed on him by a partisan source. So, like, he would get a call from the Democratic Senate Campaign Commission, and they would say, like, we're being murdered out there, like, whatever. And he'd be like, are they being murdered? And I'd be like, nope, they're not. Or like, it wasn't just one side. That's just an example. They wanted to push a message, and that it either wasn't true or was not verifiable. So that turned into stories, Jeremy. Before one filing deadline, he starts hearing from people like, oh, the Republican Party is really going to be running a pretty significant chunk of the campaign. And when the disclosures came out, I was able to say, like, yeah, actually they are taking on a lot of tasks that we typically associate with the campaign. I can see in the money that they're spending that is a thing that's happening. They're spending it on the kinds of things that usually campaigns spend money on and parties don't. So that turned into a story. Next, Jeremy. So here's another thing that came up on a sort of regular basis. I would be like, Nick, see something that's pretty weird. I don't know. Can you go like run it down? And this kind of thing also, actually, again, mostly this kind of thing did not turn into a story. He would either be like, yeah, I called somebody and they like, their computer spit out a weird number and they're planning to amend it. Or like, yeah, I called somebody and that's like totally normal. We just haven't seen it in a while because of blah, 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 or whatever. Occasionally it did turn into a story. So I started seeing that one of the major places that the Democratic Party was getting money from was Democratic state parties. So like the Florida Democratic State Party or the Oklahoma Democratic State Party or whatever, they were sending a lot of money to the National Committee. And the Republicans were doing this a little bit, but not as much. And it turns out, so I told Nick this. I was like, this looks weird to me. And he was like, yeah, that does actually seem kind of weird. He's like, I'm really busy right now. This is where the telephones come in. He was like, I'm really busy right now. Here's this guy who's like a great off-the-record source. He's not going to tell you anything, but I want you to just call him and find out what's happening. And I called him, and he was like, oh, yeah, there's a Supreme Court decision that's really relevant to that. It was the Republicans sued, and they won, and now the Democrats are like wiping the floor with them using the decision that they sued for. And that turned into this story. So that was kind of exciting. Nick made more of the phone calls, and I survived. What? Yeah, so that's another thing that actually comes from this trust situation. Nick gave me credit all the time. He is like, I mean, if you ever are in the position of being a important, awesome reporter and somebody is really making your life easier, giving them a research credit or a reporting credit is like a really good way to make them feel really great about you. Like I was like pretty new to the Times the first time Nick put me on a story, and the first time, so Nick is also like kind of famous. He has Pulitzers and stuff. So when Nick writes a story, it like might end up on A1. And so I have A1 stories despite being like computer nerd. Because I mean, I worked hard on it. I did 50% of the work on most of these stories, but I've met reporters who would not, who wouldn't have necessarily recognized the value of that work, and Nick was not one of them. He's a fantastic guy to work with. But I learned a lesson from that about the importance of giving credit to people who are doing a lot of work that might not seem necessarily like a lot of work, but like especially if it's work that I could not have done. I think was a really important lesson. So yeah, I got a byline in almost every story I worked on with Nick, which was fantastic. And so the other thing that came up is these committees have to file once a month, and so every time they filed, we would have to generate a story of some sort. And so this is sort of like the news dictating the timeline, the news dictating the coverage. So the 20th of every month, I would hop on the train, go up to New York, and we would try and figure out what the best story we could tell was, given what the news was doing. Yeah, this is their calendar. This is actually not a great slide. We could move on. So I'm just going to walk through like how we actually did this collaboration on filing night. The key is that the hard work on both sides was usually done first. So, what I was going to mention on that last slide, but you don't have to go back, is that so they give a day that filings are due, but they don't actually give a time. So most campaigns interpret that as late as possible, which means that mostly these filings are coming in at 10, 11. They usually give it a couple minutes before midnight East Coast time, so that if the software is like not working perfectly, they don't get fined by the FEC for reporting late. But their goal is to be after all the newspapers have closed for the night and before they're going to get a fine. So that is usually when they came in. So yeah, in advance of this, of these deadlines, I am making sure my software is not broken, which is important. I'm pulling historical and comparison data because sometimes we didn't have all that data loaded. It's a lot of data, and we didn't need it very often. So I would have to do like a fast last-minute process of stuff if we thought there was going to be an interesting historical comparison to a previous election. Nick is calling up his friends, being like, "Please tell me what's going to happen," because the worst case scenario for us is to be totally surprised at 10:45 p.m. by one of these things. So next slide. So yeah, we also did a lot of this. This is another Slack bot. Are you guys familiar with Slack? Some of you, maybe. It's a little bit. It's like a group instant message kind of deal. Jeremy also had one of these. Many of our reporters don't use it a ton, but the technologists really do, and in a lot of cases, so Slack might be indicating something to us that we wish the reporters were looking at, but since they're not, we can like pick up the phone and call them or shoot them an email or whatever. And so every time we find one of these filings that for a committee that we care about, Slack tells me about it. This is recent. This is like not all that interesting because it was post-election, but it was what I had. So yeah, these come in, and when they come in, Nick usually starts digging into the top lines, and I start looking like way deeper to see what's happening in the like deep in the depths of the filing. Next slide. Around this time, we usually sit down, have some dinner together. I told you about the Sichuan food. Sometimes it's pizza. Usually it was Sichuan food. There's a great restaurant not far from the Times building in New York. And this is also usually the point where we get in the same room. We're usually sort of working separately, and then we'll like sit down and like actually bounce ideas off of each other and try and figure out the direction that a story is going to go. And like whether either of us thinks the other one is wrong about what they're looking for. Go ahead. And this is what it actually looks like when we work together. Nick is like writing prose, and he's just like leaving me stuff to fill in, and also leaving me notes like, Rachel, Is this actually a thing that is happening? Please please let me know if this is wrong. So when he says a figure more typical for the House of Representatives, I now have to look up the top 5 House of Representatives races, which are not necessarily in this system because we're mostly tracking presidential stuff, and track down like their data and what their fundraising actually looks like. And then I fill in all the dollar amounts. He usually checks them as well, but that's mostly my job. Once we've sort of figured out what direction we're going. Next. Usually during this time, I encounter and resolve one or several software or data bugs. Some major examples of this, I mentioned Bernie Sanders, my least favorite presidential candidate, only because of his FEC filings. They're so big because he had so many individual donors that the Federal Elections Commission, my software did fine with them. The Federal Elections Commission software took a long time to process them. And so we would sometimes get like partial filings because it would be partway through processing. Another thing that came up during the course of the election cycle is that for some reason my internal clocks were all set on London time because that's like Greenwich Mean Time, whatever. So at midnight, all of a sudden I stopped. The first time I did this at midnight, I stopped getting filings. Or no, not at midnight. At 8 p.m. I stopped getting filings. Nothing was happening. I couldn't figure it out. I could see them coming into the FEC's website. I wasn't seeing them at all. And it turns out I was only looking at a single day. I wasn't looking at the previous day or anything. And so here I was on London time thinking it was midnight and I was done. So that was a big error that had to be fixed, sort of last minute one time. People file malformatted filings that just like choke up the whole system. Have to deal with that. Another thing that regularly happened is like a server would flicker or something like that and our bot would go down. So I wouldn't see the filings coming in. They'd be coming in fine, but I wouldn't be seeing them. So those are all things that took some fixing. And also around this time, we went and bothered our editors. That guy, Paul Volpe, dead to us. He's got like some silly job as the executive editor of Politico now. No, he's a wonderful guy to work with. And he was the one who usually would like negotiate for space in the actual paper. And then also help us talk through what was going to go in the paper the next day, what seemed like it was doable that night in time for deadline versus what was going to be maybe an enterprise story for later on. Over there, Dagny Salas, she, if you read anything about politics in the New York Times during this cycle, Dagny probably had her fingers in it somewhere. She was a web producer? Was that her title? She's going to be our boss someday. I mean, like, she's awesome. And so she would be thinking about like any strategy in terms of what we were going to do, how we were going to get it on the web. Also generally just being like a nice person, even on like 2 hours of sleep. Dagny is awesome. Yeah, we will all work for her someday. We generally had late evening surprises. Only once at like 10:30 p.m. did we have to like totally change the story we were working on. That was a terrible night. The goal was to have that happen as little as possible. But usually we had one or two things that would come up on the late side, maybe a big contribution from an LLC we had never heard of, or just like a weird expenditure or something like that. So yeah, those are things we would pay attention to. And then we would file the story. Basically at this point, Nick would usually go home and go to sleep at this point. He has a very small child. And I would just stick around until the copy editing was done, if they had questions, because honestly, often if they had questions, they were about the numbers. And then I would also just stick around till midnight to make sure nothing weird came in. If you are excited about copy editing, this is total digression. The New York Times has this great set of copy edit this quizzes now, and you can try to find their those errors, and they're actually kind of fun and hard. And they were written by one of our colleagues. They were written by somebody on our team, Sam. He worked very hard on those. So that's about all I've got in terms of how Nick and I worked together. Just a few conclusions. I don't know. You guys are probably all too young to remember Captain Planet. No Captain Planet fans. There's Captain Planet fan right there. Anyway, so with our powers combined, here, why was this collaboration important? Basically, without calling out any other organization, there are news organizations out there that don't do this with a software engineer of any kind, and they put out not often incorrect coverage, but very often incomplete coverage. They missed a lot of nuance. They missed the what was going on around these things. They might report on one big number, and then, like, here was an example of something. Actually, somebody who was an engineer did at one point. He it wasn't a story, but it was a tweet. He tweeted, like, "Oh my God, Donald Trump has given this much money in consulting fees." And because I had dug all the way into the expenditures and known exactly where that money was going, I knew that consulting actually included all of the money that he had passed through a consulting company to buy online ads. So it, like, wasn't actually very surprising, right? It was like somebody was like, "Oh my God, big deal," but it was just like a totally normal kind of thing. So we produced stories that we might have missed otherwise based on our collaboration. We didn't write some incorrect stories. Are we done? We have time? Okay. We both got to focus on what we do well and trust the other one. And we also left with a really good relationship. So we're not really doing campaign finance stories anymore because it's not really campaign finance time. But he gets in touch with me and pesters me about, like, totally unrelated data things right now that make his life as a reporter easier. And I don't really bother him that much about non-campaign finance things, but I've learned how to have a relationship with a reporter, and that means I often pester other reporters now about sort of often campaign finance things that are related to their beat. And it's really, I think, made me a better collaborator with everybody else that I have to work with. So that's, I think, all I have to say about Rachel and Nick. Yeah, you're next.
All right, now we got to talk about that totally normal election that happened in 2016. So exciting. All right, whack the button.
How are we doing on time? Oh, that was
All right, so this is the thing that we need to talk about. So this was stripped across the top of the New York Times on November 8th, low about 8:30 p.m., around the time the polls were closing on the East Coast. It showed our updated prediction, who we thought was going to win the presidential election, and we, with some certainty, decided that Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance to win, Donald Trump had a 15% chance to win, and that those odds had actually gotten a little bit better for former Secretary Hillary Clinton in the last couple days. And so, as you might realize, whack it, that was wrong. What actually happened was that Donald Trump won 306 electoral votes and the presidency. And this is what it looked like that night with these fancy little gauges. If you saw these, they might have caused your heart to beat a little faster. The jitter, by the way, was not entirely random. It was focused between the 25th and 75th percentile likelihood for a range of numbers that we believe to be true, updated every 30 seconds, which is very exciting. So, Rachel, and this is what the night looked like from our point of view. This is a view of how the model was predicting what was happening as we updated it with real voting data every 5 seconds. And so up until about 9 p.m., everything was exactly the way that we thought it was going to be. But between 8 and 9, Secretary Clinton's odds of winning the presidency dropped in our model from 80 to 70%, which was a little odd. We were like, okay, weird things are happening, but everything is still on course. But it's what happened between 9 and 10 p.m. That went really crazy. It was when Secretary Clinton went from 70% likely to win to only 40% likely to win. And then by 10 p.m., it was basically assured that Donald Trump was going to win the presidency. Their odds had reversed. He had an 88% chance to win, which means in this case, if we could simulate 1,000 elections, it means 880 of them he would win. Which, boy, that's a really big change from where we started the night, right? So, Rachel, if you'll... So we spent a lot of the next day trying to figure out why, what happened. So I will offer this one caveat. Everybody who was talking about this before about December 18th was working from incomplete data. And so what we get from the Secretaries of State in various states is top-line numbers, maybe for counties, but we don't get any voter file information, which is to say we don't know how many individual voters turned out. All we know is like the total numbers. We don't know how we may have guessed improperly about who was in the electorate. So the nice thing about a voter file is it tells you all of the people who voted in a particular area. So I believe Oklahoma actually has a public voter file, which means you can open it up and you can look up people by name. It won't tell you how they voted, obviously, but but it will tell you which primary they voted in, which gives you a pretty good educated guess that if you have an Oklahoma voter who voted in the Democratic primary, they probably voted for the Democratic nominee in the presidential election, right? And it will tell you if they voted in the presidential election or not, just not which direction, because it would be really nice that we don't publish that sort of thing. And so having this voter file data is really useful for us to check sort of how we had estimated what the electorate was going to look like. It's the way that we can guess how many votes are outstanding for individual candidates. It's the reason we even have models in the first place that let us guess what it's going to be like, what the night is going to look like in the first place, right? We didn't get any of that information back until December 18th. So we spent an entire month and a couple days completely in the dark with nothing but the top line numbers to sort through. So we have basically 2 rounds of analysis that our number crunchers went through trying to explain what happened in the 2016 election. The first is what we could do immediately after the election, and the second is what we could do once we got access to the voter file. So the first 2 things I want to show you are our guesses about what happened based on the early data that we had available, right? And the easiest thing to say is Donald Trump turned a lot of counties in the United States that had voted liberally in 2012 to voting conservatively in 2016. That is a weird and interesting thing that definitely happened. And so this chart is one easy way to take a look at it. So the top right corner would be Trump votes that had voted Democratic in 2012 that now voted conservative in 2016. And the bottom left corner would be the reverse. This would be counties that Secretary Clinton had swapped that had voted conservatively and now voted liberally in 2016, right? So you can see that Trump has a lot of very strong counties that have flipped his direction. And there's actually another way to look at it on a map, Rachel. Look at all that red in the Midwest, right? And so this is like the simplest story that we could tell directly after the election. This is one thing that we could definitely know was the case. There was a tide of change that happened in the Midwest and Rust Belt that pointed counties more conservatively than they had been. But I must caution you that this was the very first analysis that we had available, and it was not based on complete data. Now, after those voter file information was available on December 18th, we got a slightly different picture of what happened in the election. Rachel? Wham! We got a bar chart out of it. We didn't even need to make a map. Because the bar chart tells us something that is really fascinating and interesting, which is that Donald Trump won more states, more electoral votes in more closely contested races than anyone had ever won in the history of recorded elections. That is to say, he got 71 electoral votes out of states that he won by fewer than 1.5 percentage points, which is very interesting to us. And what that tells us is that it's possible. You can see Nate's conclusion at the very bottom. Nate Cohn, who is a statistician, general political science wonderkind, and the person who was spending the entire night watching his model, flicker with the as the votes came in. For lack of a better word, Mr. Trump had some very good luck. And so this is the big and outstanding question for us, in the aftermath of the election. We're looking at our models and thinking, what did we do wrong? And the big question that we have to answer for ourselves is, did we build a thing that improperly predicted this, or are we in the 15% likelihood range? Is this just the case where 15 out of 100, we're in one of the 15 worlds? Because we don't get 100 elections or even 1,000. We only get the one, right? And so we can't predict with any accuracy what's going to happen in only one. We can only guesstimate. But the problem that we have is that we don't tell you that on the homepage. We just put up a big thing that says 85 and 15, and it's left as an exercise to the reader to decide that means 85 out of 100 or 850 out of 1,000 elections are how we derive this number. And so there is a sizable problem with that, and we have to do better. So we have some theories about how we're going to do that. Rachel? Wham. So this is one of the things that makes us really upset. This is the Real Clear polling average for the state of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is one of those great states that actually does a whole bunch of state-level polling in the advance of the election. So in the year before the election, they did something like 25 or 30 state-level polls, which is fantastic. And the thing about this that's really weird is that Secretary Clinton won all of them. And not by an insignificant amount either. Her average lead in those polls was 6.5 percentage points. Which is fairly high. It was high enough, in fact, that Secretary Clinton's campaign team decided not to visit Wisconsin in the months in advance of the election, which may have been a really poor decision, but it's also sort of hindsight. Like we have 2020 when we're looking backwards. It was a totally defensible decision in advance. So, Rachel, if you'll flip the slide, this is what I felt like when I looked at those Real Clear polling averages and then the next morning went and looked at the Wisconsin results. I want to show you one particular thing. One more. There. So all that blue in the right-hand column is all the polls that Hillary Clinton won. And then at the very top, you see a little bit of red. That's Trump winning the state in the night of the election. He won by 0.7 percentage points, which is not very many, but it's more than enough to win. Rachel? Yeah, you can just stare at that for a moment. And so this is what I did. If you want to make an election nerd fume, you give them bad data and ask them to make a model of it, which is essentially the position that we were in. We were given state-level polling data and national-level tracking data and asked to build models that would explain what was likely to happen if we were to run 1,000 elections. And the way that this translated out to the public, unfortunately, is 85-15. And so this is our problem. This is like the crux, the fundamental root of our problem, right? Rachel, I want to whack one more slide. So it should be pretty obvious by now, like what happened, right? All the people who are doing predictions are being fed the exact same bits of information, right? Because polling data is what we have. That's our inputs. We have a model, which is a little bit of our secret sauce. We make some decisions about what we think the electorate is going to look like, and then we weight the polling averages as they come in. We might use the national polls to help us discern trends as they go on. But when it comes right down to it, we're just upset. So, oh, that one really didn't turn out well. Well, you can't see there's someone blessing a server, a priest blessing a server, and minus like some form of like great divine intervention. There's no way that we are going to be able to turn bad data into a decent prediction without just an awful lot of luck. So the thing that we have to keep in mind is that the world is basically dinosaurs with lasers, right? It's wild, it's crazy, it's unexpected, and campy. And it's way different than we expected. It's way different than we think of. And so when we keep that in mind, it means that we would be more defensive about the way that we explain what's happening. We might be clearer. Might be more transparent about why we make our decisions. We might show you a lot more about what's happening in our model and write a lot more about like why we make the decisions that we do and how we derive out our numbers. The truth is, we probably wouldn't have arrived at much different numbers even if we had known the way that the election would come out, because there's no way to change the model if the only thing that we feed it is polling data, and the only polling data that we have is state level polls that mischaracterize what was going to happen. So the sort of internal discussions we've been having about this is based on the weather. So we've been doing weather predictions for a really long time, and early on they were really bad. But even a bad weather prediction is better than someone saying, well, my knee itched this morning, so I feel like it's probably going to rain, right? And so this is really the equivalent of what we feel like political reporting was like before we had an opportunity to do things that were structured, quantifiable, rigorous, right? We would have our reporters, they would go do the ground game, they would ask people, how do you think things are going? They'll be like, oh, well, this campaign has a lot of momentum. They just won a couple of states. They look like they've got momentum, right? And so we would do this reporting that was based entirely on people's opinions about how things were going. It was very subjective. It removed a lot of the rigor that could clearly exist in campaign reporting. The same way that we did weather before we had weather forecasts, we removed a lot of rigor from looking at how the weather is going to be. Now, this is what a hurricane tracking map looks like. I lived in Florida for 10 years. I am deeply familiar with what hurricane tracking maps look like. And there's an entire segment of the year, 6 months or so, where you spend a lot of time in the morning looking at these tracking maps and deciding whether or not you need to go buy lots of bread and water. And so the nice thing about hurricane tracking maps is that none of them try to be 100% accurate. What they will do is they will show you transparently all of the pieces of their model. Almost all hurricane tracking is done in what's called an ensemble modeling system. That is, they take a bunch of other people's models and group them together, and they look and see what the averages looks like. And so one of the models shows the hurricane going into the Yucatan, right? One of the models shows the hurricane going to the Bahamas, and then a whole bunch kind of in the middle there say Florida. Right? And so as a person who looks at hurricane maps, you don't have to be particularly good at like understanding how statistical information is weighed. You don't have to, look at this and like effort really hard to decide where there might be error. You can look at it and make your own decision about where the hurricane is likely to go. Hint, Florida, right? And then maybe it's going to miss Florida by a little bit, but you're not going to be upset or concerned because the folks at the Weather Channel do a very good job of letting you know how they came to their conclusion, and they can point to it and say, look, this is the information we had available. We gave it to you as it came along, and then we showed you where the hurricane was going as it got closer, and our estimates of where it was going to be got more reliable, right? This is like a masterclass in presenting difficult statistical information to non-statistical people, which frankly is very difficult anyway. There's already like a there's a DataViz conference. Oh, I'm going to forget the name of it. And the entire theme this year is presenting visualizations around uncertainty. It's that hard. It's hard enough that like they can have a conference topic based entirely on it, right? And so this isn't something that we're alone in struggling with, but there are certainly places where we can look and find inspiration for how to do it better. And I think that is the number one takeaway that we're going to get from the election, is not that we predicted it wrong, but we did a really poor job of explaining how we came to our prediction and explaining why we make them even in the first place. So that's the end of our actual talky bits. Now we would like to talk to you about things, and presumably you have some questions, or it might be too early for those. But hey, there we go, a question. That's a great question. So the question is about origin stories for the people watching this on video. And so since I'm up in the mic, I'll go first. You're going to sense a theme in both Rachel and I's origin stories, and that theme is being bad at something before getting okay at something, right? And so the thing that I was bad at was taking the LSAT. I was a political science major with a minor in English literature. I desperately wanted to be a lawyer. I took the LSAT and did very poorly. And in a crisis of confidence, took a job working late night tech support at the St. Petersburg Times because my wife was a copy editor, and there was only one. That was the only way to get a job where I could work 5 p.m. to 2 a.m. For a reasonable salary. And I happen to know a little bit about computers, though mostly the how to make the printer print parts, and not a whole lot about the how to make like pretty charts or data analysis things. And so because things didn't break very often, I had a lot of free time on my hands. And because I was young then and didn't have children, I spent that free time learning to code. I learned PHP. And because my wife was on the style committee, I noticed that they had this problem where they would pass around the St. Petersburg Times' style guide, a gigantic PDF, to all the reporters every time there was an update. And the PDF was really big on some of the older machines. They couldn't even open it. And all the reporters were constantly had this problem where they had out-of-date versions of the PDF, and they would be shouting at their editors, I didn't know we changed our style about how to do, its versus its. Or actually, I believe the big one, maybe there was one about internet capitalization. Anyway, they would always have these little changes to style. It would infuriate the reporters that they never had the up-to-date version. So I said to myself, it feels like the internet has solved some of these problems. I believe that we can fix this, with the application of some technology. So I built them a wiki-based style guide. It took me like 9 months. I think I could do it in a good long weekend now. But it was good because it was my first project, and it totally solved a need that people had, which is how do we, how do we pass around this information? How do we make sure it's completely up to date? And how do we make it so that reporters don't have to open it on their ancient laptops and crash their Acrobat reader? And so that was like sort of my first taste of building applications that like help people get better at like the tasks that they do every day. And then I spent a lot of time working with reporters. I worked on PolitiFact while I was at the St. Petersburg Times, which is a interesting website that allows reporters to fact check statements made by political candidates. After that, I left and went to the Washington Post, where I worked on the 2012 election. Then I went to NPR, where I did a lot of like really interesting photo slideshows and video things. And then after that, I got this great job at the New York Times, which hopefully I will never have to leave until they fire me or cart me off dead, in a casket or something. Rachel's just going to sound an awful lot like that, just a little bit different.
So the thing I was really bad at is being a PhD student. Grad students. I'm sure there are some of you who are all still asleep. No, just kidding. Anyway, so I didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself after I graduated from college, but I was pretty good at being a student, so I decided I would like kind of keep doing that. And I applied to a PhD program in computer science, which is not a thing that I had majored in. I majored in math and linguistics, but I kind of knew I had learned like a little bit of code and whatever, and I got into this program and did that for about 2 years and realized that computer science PhD was not the right thing for me. And the reason it was not the right thing is that I was way more interested in applying existing methods to interesting data than I was I was way more interested in that than I was in developing fresh, new computer science. And unfortunately, for the most part, applying existing models to new data will not get you a PhD in computer science. So after about 2 or 3 project proposals in which that was basically what was going to happen, I said, it turns out this is not really what I want to do. So I left that program and bounced around to a couple of different jobs. Sort of the two most interesting. One is that I worked for a consulting company that did predictions based on data from the voter file. Jeremy was talking about the voter file. So if it's possible to guess how somebody is going to vote based on some of their past activities, and I worked on that kind of thing for a little while. And then I moved on and worked at a nonprofit that does open data policy and technology. And the thing that was pretty cool about that, they're called the Sunlight Foundation. They've kind of changed what they do now. But what was really great about them is that we had people who went and got hard-to-get data sets, usually from the government, and then we had other people who made them easy to use by real human beings. So that actually prepared me very well for this particular thing. And then they also let me do some writing there. So that was sort of my first shot at doing any of that, mostly about like weird technical fixes that we had done I spent a lot of time harassing Indiana, honestly, is what I did. Their state legislative people are state legislative tech people are sometimes infuriating. Anyway, and then I basically got an email out of the blue from Jeremy, who I had never met before, asking if I was interested in applying for a position at the New York Times, and actually did not know how he had found my name until after I was already hired, because it seemed like there wasn't like a good time to ask, you know? So I actually found out later that I had been recommended by the same graduate school computer science advisor, who I had kind of left in the lurch by dropping out, because she realized that it was the best decision for me, that not everybody is the right person for a PhD. And so she had recommended me to a former colleague of Jeremy's at one point and said, hey, if you're ever looking, this sounds like exactly what it was that Rachel wanted to do. She's not necessarily going to be inventing new methods, but she's going to get to apply whatever the right thing is to the data set that comes along. And so that's how I ended up here, I guess. So it depends on what I want to do with it. Frequently, often what all I want to do with it is check and make sure the first few lines look right, that it actually is what I'm going to do. And in that case, I often use just sort of like a way of I don't know if you are familiar with fiddling around in the terminal of your computer, like the thing where you just type and it responds to you. It's like, I think of it as, because I learned to computer when I was a youth, and all I wanted to do was play computer games. So I had to learn the DOS codes for my computer games. You guys are probably all too young to type the DOS codes, but I remember fiddling around with that, and that was how I interacted with my computer until I got into my Reader Rabbit or whatever it was I wanted to play. And so there's some tools that let you just like look at the first 10 lines of a file. That is probably the most frequent thing I do. Sometimes I'll open them in a text editor, usually not something like Excel, because as I said, first of all, Excel will crash with this much data. And second of all, it's actually not a useful way of looking at it. At this point, I have the processing steps down. So I usually just like either pull them into the database and look at them straight in the database, or I will use my interface to do that. But I would say my steps, if I had a random file that came to me that was a text file and I didn't have any viruses or anything, first thing I would do is look at the first 10 or 20 lines in like a terminal viewer where you can just see the first 10 lines of your file. And then if it wasn't really huge, I might open it up in a text editor and sort of text edit, whatever comes for free on your computer will probably do this. I use a different one, but and maybe I'll scroll around a bit, and then depending on what I think I want to do with it, I might think about throwing it in a relational database or something, depending on what I want to do. I'll talk about that for a moment, and then Jeremy probably also has thoughts. For the people at home, the question, and tell me if I got this wrong, had to do with how whether the New York Times is ever interested in like publishing the data sets or larger portions of data sets that we use to generate the stories. Is that a good summary? Okay. And I would say that we have experimented with that to some degree. Something that I know Jeremy will say if I don't say it first is now that we have somewhat more ability to play around with metrics and see what readers are doing, we've learned that the following kind of graphic or information source is always unsuccessful, and it is explore the data. Very, very few people actually explore the data. So you might notice that the New York Times almost never has a thing that's like, here's a lot of data, poke around. And it's because people generally don't come there to do it. We have in the past released some data sets. The person who had my position before I did focused more on releasing data sets and a little bit less on like helping reporters understand them. And I think that, I mean, and he wasn't like he was fired or anything, but he moved on to another organization that was focused more on that kind of thing because he didn't feel like the Times was supportive of that. And I actually think that having organizations with those different kinds of missions is important, but having one organization that maybe that does all of that stuff is maybe not the right approach. I could be wrong about that, but like having people focus on what they're good at and having the space separated, I think is valuable. So I can tell you, he works at ProPublica now, and they publish all of their congressional data. They publish all of their campaign finance data. What am I missing? They have some great data sets that they are really the only source for. So if you want to know whether the doctor you're going to go to has taken money from a specific pharmaceutical company, they have that data searchable on their website. I have looked up, the person I actually looked up is not my doctor, but my father-in-law who's a physician. And I like sent him an email and I'm like, looks like you took 3 pens from a pharmaceutical company once. And he was like, can't believe I picked up those pens. Because he's like very strict about not wanting to do that. So yeah, there are some places out there. Sunlight Foundation, where I used to work, did a lot of this. They don't really do it anymore. I think one of the reasons that it's hard for the Times, and this is my own opinion, I have no idea what the real policy is because there are going to be errors in those data sets, and we have a very strong aversion to being wrong. ProPublica, I think, they're sort of more experimental, and they are more able to be wrong in their own conception of themselves. So I think that's probably why we do less of it than them. If you're ever interested in a data set, you should email the reporter. Especially if it's graphics, especially if there's a graphic, they usually print where they got their data. And if they don't, email them, and their answer might be, oh, the data set is like here's a great example. The New York Times has been experimenting with showing Senate votes live as they happen. So we want you to be able to see, as the vote is happening, which senator, and we've been doing this particularly for confirmation hearings, which senator is voting for whom, or voting yes or no, like within 5 seconds of the vote taking place. So we did this. We did this for the Rex Tillerson Secretary of State vote. And we got a lot of notes from people who were like, what's your data set? Here's what our data set is. Our data set is me and a graphics reporter sitting. We were listening to C-SPAN. We were listening to it. She was 40 seconds ahead of me, so I could correct her. And we were typing. That's what our data source was. And I mean, the whole data, that's only 100 pieces of data. It was published in the story. But like sometimes we are generating our own data set, and it's not really like there isn't a source there. And we might, again, in that case, that's sort of silly to hand off because it's all there on the page. But if somebody is generating a data set like that, they might very well be happy to give it to you, or point you to the one they use. Do you have more thoughts? I'm sure you have thoughts.
Ooh, that's a really great question, by the way. This is one of the things that we fight with internally because Rachel and I are very much like data advocates. I would be a huge fan of just having a giant CSV download link at the bottom of all of our stories, or you can just click a button and get whatever data you want. And I think the reason why I want that thing is because I believe it's a trust signal. For example, if you read a story on a blog that has no byline, subconsciously you downgrade the trust in that thing 1 unit, and you don't even know that you're doing it. There are great studies about this, about how you decide whether or not the thing that you're reading is trustworthy. And one of the trust signals that exists are things like click here to see the data behind the story. And even if no one ever clicks on it, it could just be like a dead link. That acts as a trust signal to people who are looking at it. And like subconsciously, it makes them feel, aha, this must be a valuable thing. Like looking at footnotes in a paper. Even if all the footnotes, all they say are just like, a thing that I looked at one time, or a bird told me this, you know, like you feel like a paper is more trustworthy because it has, you know, lots and lots of footnotes. Fascinating, by the way, an entire area of research based on this that is just utterly fascinating to me. But I am really, I do a lot of thinking about how we can modify our stories to increase the number of trust signals that are available to our readers, the kinds of things that will make them feel that we can expose about our reporting or about our research that will give that will give people an indication of how much different, how much more work goes into our story than, say, a different kind of story, right? So an example of this would be we might want to do more writing about the kinds of models that we use when we're making predictions. It would also be really nice to release, you know, the R code behind that model so that we could have people poke at it. I really feel like this is going to be like a long-term struggle for us, but we're pushing for it a lot. Rachel and I, actually, the little team that we work for at the Times is called Interactive News, and about 2/3 of the software that we write is released as open source modules, which is really nice. I wrote a lot in the last year just around the election. So like all of the election, real-time election code that we used is available as a big open source model called Alex. And you could use it if you were an AP subscriber to like parse in real time all the AP's data, which is really fancy. And that's about the closest we've really been able to get to kind of cracking that nut. But that's really going to be a thing that we do in like 2017 and 2018 is like try to figure out how to expose more of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes so that people can feel more comfortable with the kind of reporting that we're doing. At the very least, to expose like all the hard work that our reporters are actually doing, you know, and whether that be in a data set or in like an explanation of the way that they go about their business, I feel like that's something that we will definitely be doing more of. Yeah, so for the folks at home, it's a question about how big data might change the way we do reporting. I like that question a lot because like 100% of my focus now is on is writing software and incorporating technology around our news gathering. So much of the work that goes on at many media companies, including the one that I work for, is about applying technology to the output, right? Like we make the story look better, it's scrollier, it has video, you know, like it's more visual, etc. I don't think that that's a bad thing to do. I am like personally obsessed with spending way more time writing software about news gathering and like reporting. And the reason why I find big data, even though we never really technically work on any big data. I mean, like the biggest data set that we deal with is Rachel's campaign finance stuff, which is in the millions of rows, which, you know, like anybody who's working on like even like light analysis of like a social media accounts would be like 1 million nodes. That's nothing, you know, like, so truthfully, we work on medium data at the very most, you know, at the moment. There are definitely some of those techniques that are really useful when we're doing like document analysis, you know, like obviously we're working on, you know, trying to understand the web of the Trump companies as they exist in the world. Some of these things get to about the level of medium data that we need to use, like you know, bigger tools to analyze. But when it comes specifically to election predictions, because there was like a wing of that question that was like, you know, will you be using like, you know, what's the name of the company? Cambridge Analytics, right? That does the they come up with essentially a guesstimate on how an individual voter will vote based on things that they can get, like credit card information, that is a bunch of disparate sources that aren't necessarily located in a voter file, which is at the moment the largest data set that we use about trying to predict how individual people will vote. I imagine whatever data we can get our hands on that will help us make more accurate election predictions, we will definitely use, and more likely we will spend a lot of time writing about how those things are either really really interesting or uninteresting as it comes about. The problem that with Cambridge Analytica in particular is that they don't make a lot of the way that their model works public, because it's obviously they're like a for-profit company and that's their secret sauce. The part about this that's very interesting is that it appears to have worked this time. But the part about it that makes me a little skeptical is that it hasn't been evaluated particularly rigorously, and we only have like 1 or maybe 2 or 3 tests about how well it worked. We don't have any of the tests to see how poorly it worked. Were there elections in which people used the software and then lost, in like large numbers when they should have probably won? Those will be more interesting things for us to take a look at, and I would be fascinated to see the inner workings of how their model works. But it's one of those things that we probably won't really be able to examine. We'll just have to look at it like a black box and see what goes in and then what comes out. So, but I believe Nate is interested in this, and I know Rachel will have some stuff to say about it.
Oh yeah. So this is I'm going to take this in like a slightly different direction, which has to do with post-election magic reporting, which is the thing that I'm doing my best to prevent my friends and colleagues from doing too much of. And I've also read stories about Cambridge Analytica and other similar companies, and I would encourage you to check out the stories that were written after the 2008 election and the 2012 election about similar magic people and magic sauce, many of whom worked on the Clinton campaign, right? So like one serious problem we have with elections is that, like, let's say you work at a company and you're trying to meet sales targets or whatever, and you miss this sales target. Well, you got another one next month, and maybe you didn't miss by that much. And if you missed by like 10 people, or 10 sales or whatever, you still did pretty well, right? That is not true in elections. Elections are binary. You either win or you lose. They're once every 4 years, and they're basically a weighted coin flip, right? But if you lost by 0.00001%, you still lost, right? So like they're hard things to use as the full evaluation of one of these things, and thus I remain like somewhat skeptical of any story that claims that there was one thing that changed the election. The other thing that happens in that case, and I've actually seen this specifically happen, is that if you have any reason that you can claim that you were the reason they won the election, that is very good for your bottom line, right? Suddenly everybody wants your secret sauce instead of the other guy's secret sauce. So there's a lot of PR that goes on after an election among the people who worked on it, trying to jockey for like we were the special thing, and maybe they were, right? I mean, we don't know that because, as Jeremy said, we can't see inside the box. So this is, again, I haven't answered your actual question at all about big data in the newsroom, but I have expressed to you my extreme skepticism of magic bullets, especially in cases where we only are able to evaluate them once every 4 years on a single binary decision. So the question is about how interactive tools have impacted engagement and viewership / readership when people are engaging. Do you have good thoughts about that? I could make it up, but you'll probably be better.
All right. So one of the things we do every year is we post the top 10 stories on the New York Times, and there's like a variety of metrics that we use every year to determine what the top 10 are. This year, they booted out the only byline that I had in 2016 because it was our election results page. And I was really frustrated by that because it had by far the most page views, the most engagement, longest time spent on site of any of the articles that we had. This is just me being like really upset that I got knocked out of the list because it doesn't count because it's an election page. But the more specifically about interactive tools, the number one is almost always, it's never a story. It's always some form of interactive graphic, whether it's a chart. Until this year's election results page, the highest trafficked article on the New York Times site was the dialect quiz that you could go in and put some information. You would click on some stuff that was like, oh, I call soda pop, and I call chips crisps or whatever, and then it says, look, you're from London, and it would tell you like what area of the United States you were likely from based on your answer to a handful of these like sort of dialect things. Generally, those things tend to do very, very well. The part about it that's really difficult is that they are very expensive for us to produce, not in terms of money, but in terms of like people and time. And it requires an awful lot more careful editing than you would think, especially for any of these things that have like a large range of possible outcomes, like the dialect quiz. Like there's something like 30 questions in the quiz, and if you click them in different orders or whatever, there's like the combinatorial number of possibilities that you can get out of it is very, very high. This makes copy editors like really upset because they want to check every single part, and so it becomes really difficult for us to edit these things and to make sure that it tells a compelling story, and all of that just takes lots of time. So we treat these things like big pieces of enterprise, and it's not like they're rather costly, and so we're really careful. We still don't release tons and tons and tons of graphics and visuals. The Wall Street Journal, I was talking to the graphics director at the Wall Street Journal the other day. They do something like 100 charts in every edition of the Wall Street Journal. We do something like 12 in the New York Times, and it's not because like we have very different opinions about what should be in there. We think that our report should be as visual as possible. It's just that we have like we are really aggressive about editing those things. We don't like let our reporters build charts, generally speaking, and those are one of the things that we're like considering making very different. The Times just released this report, an internal report called the 2020 report, and it's essentially like a lot of like internal thoughts about what our newspaper would look like in the year 2020 and what kind of changes we would need to make in order to still be around and a functioning media company then. And the number one takeaway was that we need to be more visual. And that doesn't just mean like photography and video. It also means things like interactive graphics, charts, etc. And so that's definitely something that's going to be a big focus for us because our users overwhelmingly enjoy them. Yeah. So the question is, how do news how I'm going to interpret this. All right. The question is, are news organizations somewhat complicit in spending a lot of time talking about the new president or Kellyanne Conway, some of his aides, and are we making these people more important than they really ought to be? I think the answer is we are not. We are not complicit in making it. Like, this is the president of the United States, right? It's kind of a big deal. In 2009, I was talking to our bureau chief about this the other day, the DC bureau chief. In 2009, we had so many reporters and editors come down from New York, to cover the new administration, that we ran out of space in the bureau, and the people were working from not the bureau. They were having to work from like other office locations and things like that. So it's not like entirely unprecedented for us to like go kind of gaga when a new administration comes in. In particular, there's an awful lot more happening behind the scenes than we're really very good at translating. When the Obama administration was particularly smooth, in the words of our the White House reporters that we had that were working then. But if you go back to the when the Clinton administration took over in 1992, that was quote unquote crazy. And so we have like some White House reporters who were talking about things that sounded very similar to me to how the Trump administration was taking over. They hadn't confirmed a lot of people to lead some agencies. There were staffers who hadn't read any of the memos that were left behind by the previous administration. And that doesn't even include the current administration. They have like all this web presence they have to update now, right? And this is like, so they have like an entirely new front. They have the web, they have social media, all these things that didn't even exist in 1992, right? I can't imagine. It would have been really fun to watch the Clinton campaign, which struggled with even the things that they had available at the time. What would they have done with the president's Snapchat account? Like, who knows? Like, it would have been really interesting to watch. But I think that generally speaking, I think that it is probably proper for us to spend a lot of time, especially on a new administration, and especially when it's a switch in parties. There's a lot of stuff about the Obama administration that's going to get rolled back, in particular because the Obama administration was very fond of executive orders, and so the Bush administration is using executive orders to undo a lot of that same stuff. So this just requires a lot of reporting. Honestly, there's just a lot of stuff happening that requires like boots on the ground. We have national security reporters, people who used to be in like Kabul, Afghanistan, or out other places, who are like in the U.S., not just in the U.S., but like instead of covering the DOJ or the FBI, they're like literally just working on like the Trump transition still, because it just requires that level of additional reporting for us to like stay up, and it's way different than the campaign. I mean, the campaign is really exhausting, and we have to put a lot of reporters out because there's so many candidates at the very beginning. We need to make sure we're covering everybody. But the campaign also ends, after a year, and the reporters can go on like a long vacation, But now we're in this position where we weren't just covering a campaign, but now we're having to cover an entirely new administration. We have to make new friends. We have to, our reporters have to like learn who the new people are that they can talk to get like real stuff, even on background about how the administration works. And so it's just a really fascinating time. Honestly, I love working in the DC bureau, but I double love working in the bureau in DC right now, because all of the effort that's going to covering the transition is just fantastic, and it makes for great shouting matches in the newsroom. And sitting next to the bureau chief and the editors means that we get to hear like every single one, including some things that I would never say on camera. And Rachel maybe has some interesting things to say about this too.
So we also have the sort of mixed blessing of being on a lot of email lists, just sort of by virtue of being in Washington. They're like, oh yeah, let's put the nerds in the corner on this email list too. So we've seen a lot of back and forth on this, and we've seen particularly a lot of back and forth on how to cover Twitter, which I know is a thing that a lot of people are talking about. And I think that the consensus seems to be like, if you went and did a photo shoot of the president or someone like that, and he made an offhand comment that was not off the record, just like commented something to you, after that you would cover it, right? Like, he's the president of the United States, and I know news organizations are going to make different decisions, but I don't think anyone is going to stop covering his comments, because those could be policy, and in some cases they could unilaterally become policy, and like there's nothing to be done. I have a little bit less to say, I guess, about the pre-election stuff. I mean, everybody is entitled to their opinion, but I'm going to go back to exactly what I said before, which is that we have exactly one way of evaluating what happened, and it's a single instance that is like a coin flip of a slightly weighted coin, probably. And like, I'm sure we could sit here and come up with a list of 60 or 70 or 80 things that could have gone into that. But we just don't have the counterfactual, right? We don't know what would have happened in another case. We don't know what the one feature is. And honestly, I think it's very unlikely there was a single feature that caused that to happen. There were millions of different little things. Everybody's vote was made up by a different little stew of things. And one of those may have been seeing Trump's face a lot more often than other candidates. But some of them could have been also totally unrelated things that you were sick on somebody was sick on election day and didn't go. Like that was so I guess I mean, I know that is sort of a weird thing to say like we just can't know, but the answer is we really can't know. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm sure some of you have read The Upshot, or you've read things by The Upshot potentially without even knowing that they're The Upshot. And that was, I think, intentionally designed. Oh, I should say the question was had to do with uncertainty and facts. Facts sometimes coming with uncertainty. Okay. so the upshot was designed intentionally, I think, as an experiment in communicating uncertainty. And depending on how you feel about how it's done, I would say that it is still an ongoing experiment. My suspicion is that we'll continue to see more and a continuation of that kind of stuff from the upshot and from like a segment of the paper, and then there will be other parts of the paper that will continue to do like pretty traditional journalism, not necessarily in the way that it is presented or whatever, but like in the way that the standards and ethics and stuff that people have always. I mean, I think the ethics are true across the board, but the standards that are sort of more traditional. A thing that I think we could potentially do better on, and this is like certainly an issue across the board at the Times, is that it used to be that the paper came in a bunch of different sections and you knew 100% for sure what part of the paper you were reading, and it was really clear from a bunch of different cues whether you were reading. Do I have to? No, you're just okay. Waving. Whether you were reading something that was street news, opinion, or like in a feature section where it might be a little bit not an opinion, but like an experiment with uncertainty or something like that. And I think that is much harder to tell on the web because opinion, if we're showing you related coverage, we might pop up. I'm not involved in these decisions at all, but an opinion piece might pop up or a news piece might pop up on the opposite as a like recommended, why don't you read this? And I don't think a lot of readers are necessarily scrolling to the top and seeing that it says opinion there or whatever. There's like a lot of really a lot more confusion there in the web era, and I know that's the thing that we've talked about, and I think is also relevant to what you're talking about, which is if there are places in the paper that we experiment more, how do we make them visually different? How do we make it clear that that it's a little bit more of a sandbox? Because I would say that I like strongly hesitate to use the term fact-based journalism, but like traditional journalism with traditional journalism standards is not going away.
I would add to that. I'm fascinated by ways to do this on non-visual stories. So, like, obviously, we have a lot of people who are spending a lot of time right now thinking about how to show like margins of error, likelihood, etc., in our visual devices. But we have not spent nearly as much time thinking about how we would do that in a standard news story, which is the vast majority of what we publish is standard news stories, right? And there's a particular example that I really like. When I was interviewing at the Times the first time I did really poorly. That's another big takeaway, by the way. It's okay to bomb an interview because 2 years later they'll interview you again and then hire you. You might even do better because then they'll know who you are and they'll have been following you in their like weird recruiting database, right, Rachel? It's fantastic. Anyway, the second time I interviewed, the day before my interview, like I grabbed a copy of the paper and brought it with me, and there was a story on the front page. It was written by Eric Schmidt, who's a reporter in the DC bureau. He writes about drone strikes, and the headline had said 200 suspected militants die in drone strike, largest such strike in months, right? Which was not factually incorrect. It was the largest such strike in months, but it was also wrong. And it was wrong because it was the largest strike ever. But they didn't know that because our reporters, in the process of their reporting, always check the number of like suspected militants who die. They have to put a number in the story. It's really useful for us to give context. But when they're done with the story, they like wad up that number and like throw it away, right? And then they lose this like important bit of like structured data that they had been generating. They didn't even realize that they were generating in the process of their reporting, right? And so Eric Schmidt was this guy who, if he had thought to like put the stuff in a spreadsheet, just a boring spreadsheet. We're not even talking like big data. This is just like, there's maybe been like 200-300 drone strikes over the last half decade, right? And so even if he'd been covering it for 5 years, he would have like a really handy list. He would have been able to be more quantitative and more correct. He would have been able to say this is the largest strike that we have record of in the last 5 years. And to me, that's the sort of thing that where we communicate a certainty, right? This is the largest such thing in months. But really we could be more certain. We could be more better. And that's just like a written newspaper story, right? We wouldn't even need a chart for that. That's just something that would make us more correct when we're writing. And I feel like there are many cases like that where our reporters are doing like standard like journalism. They're making telephone calls, getting in touch with sources, etc. And there are definitely places where we could be more more correct if we were being more structured about the way that we handle our news gathering. And so, again, I'm fascinated by that, and hopefully that'll be the thing that Rachel and I are working on for like the next 2 or 3 years. Anybody else? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it wasn't us. So we have, there's a pair of folks at the Times who are like basically immersed in this, right? There's Nate Cohn, who writes for The Upshot, and Josh Katz, who also, he works on the graphics team, but he is like embedded in The Upshot. And Josh is like a trained statistician. Nate is a political science major, but is like freakishly interested in like the inner workings of campaigns. And I'm just waiting for him to write a book because I would read the ever-loving snot out of it. So the question is about, have we considered like all the different ways in which polling might have led us astray? Are there like threads that we should be pulling on? So the answer is yes, there are threads we should be pulling on. And I would really be interested in our reporters doing more reporting about how polls are constructed. The Upshot had my favorite piece of the 2016 election. I am a little biased, but they gave the same polling data to 4 or 5 different pollsters, and then asked them to just show us the weights, the way that they had like taken that polling data and weighted it in their model, and got wildly different results as a result. And that's not even messing around with the actual polling itself, right? That's just the interpretation of the like raw poll data. That was enough to make like these wildly different interpretations, right? We got 1 or 2 people who were like sort of left-leaning, at least one guy who was a little conservative, and like 2 or 3 people who were in the middle. And it was fascinating to see that. And that wasn't even about how we construct the polls. That was just using the same bit of polling data. The real problem with like attempting to evaluate a poll is that you don't have anything to evaluate it against, right? And this is where Rachel has a really interesting thought on this, right? About the election as like a binary outcome. And so it's very difficult for us to find evidence that there are like recalcitrant Trump voters, because all we have to find those voters is actual election outcomes and polls, right? And so when those are the only 2 sources of inputs that you have, it's really hard to use one source of input, like the election outcome. So naturally, we're going to find all of these things that look like they were the cause of Trump's win, when in fact they were maybe just correlated with Trump's win, or maybe they in some ways there were things that he could have had a much larger margin if it hadn't have been for X, right? And so this is the problem, is finding all these disparate threads in the polls, right? Prestige votes, people who flipped at the last minute, right? This was a really interesting theory that like people are discussing now. Is like last minute voters appeared to vote in larger numbers for Trump than we expected. But all of it comes down to whether or not we have a reliable way of even measuring that thing in the first place, which is very difficult. And so I actually expect to hear much better about this from Rachel, but I would love to see just a much deeper understanding of what goes into the polling, not just the modeling. And we don't report on it very much at all. We report on the final numbers, but not a lot on how those numbers are built. And there's a ton of chatter that goes on, like in the Upshot Slack between like Josh Katz and Nate Cohn, Amanda Cox, these people who are like really great, like thoughtful statistics folks, about like why X poll was not particularly good, or why this is like a really poor outcome. And I would be fascinated if we could turn that into a better form of reporting, like an actual line of things that we report on, rather than just like something that informs our reporting. Rachel now should talk about the important parts.
How many of you guys have a landline? Hands? Who has a landline? I think I see 3. 4 maybe. Okay, so you guys are hard to reach by pollsters. Okay, here's another question. Your cell phone rings and it's an unknown number. Do you pick it up? Raise your hand if you pick it up. All right, so we got a couple who pick it up. You might be whatever. I rarely pick up my cell phone even when I do know who's calling, because I would really much rather that they send me a text or an email or something so I can respond asynchronously in my own time. Yeah. So that's a problem, right? Like, it used to be that here's how polling worked. They would call a house, and that house had a telephone. They would call a telephone number, and that was associated with a house that had a family at it. And like, you guys probably all know that. You probably all know this already. But anyway, it's like a really serious problem we have, that like polling is the only thing that we've got, and yet it does not comport with the way that we live our lives at this point. People are just really hard to reach, and because of that, so it used to be like you would call if you wanted to reach. Let's say you wanted to reach 100 people, and you wanted them to be half men and half women. Your sample, because of bad luck on who you called, you maybe ended up with like 43 women and 57 men in that. Math in the head, it's hard. And so you would have to do a little bit of weighting, because you know that your population is actually 50-50. You'll have to count the women's opinions like a little bit more because you didn't get quite enough of them on the phone. Well, that was great, but you were able to still reach people who looked like the people you wanted to talk to. And that is just like, that doesn't exist anymore. It's like almost impossible to talk on the phone to people under the age of 30. And then when you add a couple of other demographics, you might have called 10,000 people and you might have reached one Hispanic woman under the age of 30. And so now you're trying to say like, oh, if I want to represent all Hispanic women under the age of 30 in this state that I'm calling, do I count that one Hispanic woman's opinion? Well, she's probably weird if she was the only one you could reach on the phone, right? Like, there's something that makes her different that caused her to actually pick up her phone or have a landline or whatever. Or maybe you could say, well, maybe Hispanic women are like 30% like women, and 15% like Hispanic men, and 73% like young people. I mean, it's like there's not really a good solution to the fact that there are big chunks of the population that you just can't reach. And I don't know if that played a huge role one way or another, but it has dramatically changed the way we've done polling. And I think that we're seeing in a lot of different contexts that we aren't as good at it as we used to be. Again, not because the methodology has changed, but because the methodology hasn't changed. So I don't really know. I mean, people ask me a million times since I've worked in various fields like this during the election. They said, I see this poll and it's different from the others. What do you think? And I would generally respond, I think polling is BS. That's my personal opinion, not the opinion of anyone who I might work for. And I have no answer besides that. I just don't really trust it. And it's really frustrating because you really want an answer and there just isn't one. There's just not good answers there in terms of what's going to happen and in terms of what has happened, in my opinion. And I would love to see somebody come up with a really innovative approach to make this better. I haven't really seen a lot of like web polling that's great because it's easy to like stuff, it's easy. I mean, we all see like every time Stephen Colbert is like, Stephen Colbert was like, I want to win this presidential poll, he would win it because his people would go find it and they do it, right? Like we have like a treadmill on a space station named after him because of this. Bodie McBoatface, that was like a thing that happened, right? Like, I mean, we've got a really interesting, tough problem, and I would love to see like the innovation on the people who actually solve it eventually. But like we have a tough data problem. So I just want to be 100% clear that I do not work on this. So like anything that I say about it will be complete speculation. The question was, are there good proxies for who is likely to vote and how they're likely to vote? In my experience working on things sort of similar to this in the past, asking somebody whether they're likely to vote is actually, you do want to use a proxy for that, because asking somebody whether they're likely to vote is like a really poor predictor of whether they're likely to vote, because most people hear that as like, are you a patriotic American? And then they say yes. Actually, I think that people who say probably that's actually the most accurate, because people who say they're probably going to vote are people who've like actually thought about it. And like if you say you're definitely going to vote, like a bunch of those people are people who have never voted in their lives before, but like you're asking them if they're patriotic and they say yes. So yeah, there certainly is use of proxies, usually in the case of past voting history of whether you're going to vote. It's like past voting history. Like people who vote tend to keep voting. But like what you're going to miss is a whole new population that's going to vote. And I certainly don't have an answer to that. He does not want to touch that question. So if we're like out of time or you guys have to go or whatever, if we have like one last one or. Like, do you mean at the paper, or do you mean like in it? Like, do you mean like business decisions in the paper, or do you mean like election prediction data? So the question is Facebook and other digital stuff in terms of election prediction, and do we use it? I don't think at the times we do. I know from like previous life experience that people are trying to do that. The people who are doing best at it are campaigns themselves, because they have a compelling reason for which you might want to interact with them on Facebook, because it's hard to get that data if you're not a campaign, right? I'm sure that these consulting companies, like we talked about Cambridge Analytica, there's some big ones on the Democratic side too. I'm sure that they're using as much of that as they can, but it's way easier to do if you have a reason why somebody wants to interact with you, because I can't just come take your Facebook data if you have any reasonable privacy setting and you haven't chosen to interact with me. So it's hard to do if you're not the campaign, right? I can't just scrape everyone's likes, and it's really hard for me potentially to match you to the real human being that you actually are in a poll or on my voter file or whatever. So I don't think we're doing that internally. I think we would love to if we had the data. I'm sure that Nate Cohen would be like all about that, but I don't think it's available.
Oh, he's all about it.
Woo, this is a great question. We had like a little mini fight about it at one point about how we could leaven our polling data with like other stuff, including but not limited to social networks. One of the things that's like really I have like two brief observations. First, campaigns do use this information, but they're also not particularly, it doesn't help them particularly much. A key thing to keep in mind is that even the Trump folks thought they were going to lose on the last day. I mean, like there's no question that they were using like even better stuff than we've got. They clearly have like a very strong, like everybody has like a strong data ground game. You have to be if you have like millions of dollars and you're spending it on trying to win a presidential election, which is a pretty big deal. And even those folks thought they were losing. If they had thought they were winning, they would have been way more prepared for the transition, and they wouldn't have said things to the Hill like we thought we were losing. And so they have like there is no question that campaigns are further ahead on predicting individual votes than we are. And particularly, there are going to be like contractors who are doing this way better, because there are like 3 people at the New York Times who are working on this, and the practical outcome for us is, yay, we got to write a good story, right? There are like 50 people working on this for a campaign, or maybe 100, and the practical outcome for them is we get to control the free world, right? And so like the incentives don't even come near lining up. And so it's much harder for us to we just don't have the same incentive that they do. The second thing I'll mention, particularly about social networks, is it's confounding that they are not a very good slice of America, generally speaking, and it's really hard for us to decide just how they're weighted wrong. So, for example, Twitter is generally not a very good cross-section of America. It's it's people who are very technologically literate, it's people who are in a certain age group, and it's people with a certain set of ethnicities. And so it makes it very difficult for us to use that information unless we weight it really heavily. And all that weighting, as Rachel previously pointed out, is places where we can go really wrong. So it's going to be tough for us to incorporate it. Facebook would be the closest because so dang many people use it. It's a much better cross-section of the United States. But if we use something like Snapchat, it's like wildly weighted towards people who predominantly don't vote, So it makes it a lot harder for us. We would have to use like a broad spectrum of social networks and be really careful to get people who get rid of people who weren't in the United States, who were likely voters. Oh God, it's so complicated. Anyway.
So one thing that we did do this cycle that I forgot about until this very moment is one of our colleagues, also named Jeremy, wrote a thing that would let you, if you were a Facebook user, you could send them any ads you saw. So what he was trying to do is get to the idea that campaigns are marketing differently to different people. So that was like a cool experiment. It turned into like 1 or maybe 2 stories, but it was still like a pretty cool experiment in how we might go about using Facebook. If you want to hear more about that, happy to talk at a time when I'm not about to get the Oscar music.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel and Jeremy. We're getting kicked out, so We have to leave. They will be in my office in the third floor if you guys want to come up, have more questions. I think they'd be more than happy to answer them. Those of you in my class, kind of check in with David before you leave. Give him a high five so that we know you're here. And all right, we got to go, guys.